My mother was laughing at me across the boardroom table, and I just let her. She was telling the other shareholders that her own daughter had spent 3 years inflating project budgets to skim contractor fees. She said it with that particular smile she saved for charity galas, the one that looks warm from a distance. My younger brother sat beside her, nodding along, straightening his cufflinks. The company's external auditor, a man I had personally recommended to the board 2 years earlier, would not meet my eyes. I was sitting completely alone on my side of the table. No lawyer, no documents, just me and a cold cup of coffee I had not touched since the meeting started. Then the board chair, a woman named Elspeth Haverford, who had known my mother for 30 years, looked down at the papers in front of her and said something that made my mother stop laughing. She said she would not be accepting the audit findings, not until she heard from the silent majority shareholder. My mother looked confused for exactly 3 seconds. Then she looked at me, and her smile disappeared entirely. My name is Sabla Rana, and I am 31 years old. In the private equity circles that operate quietly out of Calgary and Toronto, people who know my real work call me by a different name. But I will get to that. To my family, I was just the difficult daughter they had managed to sideline by the time I turned 28, the one who left after the inheritance dispute, the one who, according to my mother, had always been a little too ambitious for her own good, which in her language meant too independent to be useful. Let me tell you how it started. Because it did not start in that boardroom. It started 11 months earlier at my brother's engagement party on the back patio of a house in Rosedale that my mother bought with money that should have belonged equally to both of us. The night was warm for October in Toronto. My mother had rented heaters and strung fairy lights through the Japanese maples and invited people I had not seen since my father's funeral. I arrived late because I had been on a call with my operations director finalizing a deal I cannot discuss publicly. I was wearing a plain wool blazer and dark trousers, practical, nothing that would invite commentary. It invited commentary. My future sister-in-law, whose name is Pippa, spotted me before I even reached the terrace steps. Pippa has the particular gift of making cruelty sound like concern. She floated over in a dress that cost what most people pay in monthly rent, pressed both my hands between hers and said loudly that she was so glad I had made it and that it must have been hard to get away from work on a Tuesday, especially with things being so uncertain right now. She glanced pointedly at my blazer. She said she thought it was admirable that I had not let myself go entirely, considering everything. I did not know what everything referred to. I smiled and said congratulations and looked for the bar. My mother found me before I got there. She walked me to the far end of the patio with that grip she has, fingers around my elbow like she is guiding me somewhere helpful. She said she needed to speak to me about the shares. My father had built Renner Distribution over 30 years, regional logistics, freight coordination across Ontario, Alberta, and BC. When he died 18 months ago, he left the company to both of us equally, 40% each, with the remaining 20 held by the board. My mother was supposed to manage the estate through the transition. Instead, she had spent those 18 months maneuvering, quietly with my brother's help, to have my shares reclassified as non-voting on the basis of a clause in the original incorporation documents that their lawyer had conveniently rediscovered. On the patio, she explained this to me as though she were discussing a scheduling problem. She said the board had reviewed the clause. She said my brother needed stability going into the expansion. She said it was nothing personal, it was just what made sense for the company. I looked at her. I thought about all the things I could say. I said, all right. I said I would think about it. She visibly relaxed. She actually patted my hand. Then she walked back toward the lights and the heaters and the people who did not know any of this was happening, and I stood at the edge of my father's garden and watched her go. And I felt something settle in my chest like river ice in February. Cold, solid, patient. I had been building something for the past 2 years that my family knew nothing about. It started as something else, honestly. I left the family company before my father died because I could not stand the way my brother was running the Western operations, the corner cutting, the vendor kickbacks he thought nobody was tracking. I used my savings and my severance and 18 months of brutal work to co found a supply chain consultancy with two people I trusted. We went after underperforming logistics companies, found the inefficiencies, restructured them, flipped them profitable. We were good at it. Then we were very good at it. Then we had enough capital and enough reputation that larger funds started parking money with us. By the time my mother reclassified my shares, my consultancy had quietly acquired a minority position in the primary lender that held Renner Distribution's main operating credit line. Not controlling. Not yet, but enough that when the lender's internal review flagged the company's accounts receivable irregularities, someone I trusted was in the room when they decided how to proceed. I did not do anything that night at the engagement party. I went home. I let my mother believe she had handled me cleanly. The next morning, I started making calls. My mother spent the following 3 months constructing her case. She hired an auditor. She had my brother compile a report showing discrepancies in the project billing from the 2 years I worked in operations. Some of the numbers were real anomalies, mistakes made by junior staff that I had flagged internally and corrected. She presented them as a pattern. She had a document drafted unsigned that attributed the discrepancies to deliberate fraud on my part. She was not planning to go to the police. She was planning to use it as leverage to make me sign away my shares voluntarily to protect the family from scandal during the expansion round. She told me this herself in my apartment on a Thursday evening in January. She came alone. She sat at my kitchen table with a leather folio and a bottle of wine she brought as though this were a normal visit. And she poured 2 glasses and then she slid the document across to me and explained what it was. I read it carefully, every page. She watched me read it, and when I finished, she said in the gentlest possible voice that she hoped I understood she was doing this because she loved me. She said my father had always struggled with my stubbornness. She said signing was the only way to keep the family intact. She said she would make sure I was financially looked after, that there would be a settlement, something quiet and handled by their solicitor. She said she did not want to use the audit findings publicly, but that she would if she had no other choice. I looked at my mother across my kitchen table and I thought about my father. I thought about the way he used to call me on Sunday evenings just to talk about whatever he had been reading that week. I thought about how he had told me, 2 months before he died, that he was sorry he had not done more to protect me from the way things worked in that family. He said it quietly, in a hospital room in Sunnybrook, like he was handing me something he should have given me years ago. I thought about all of that, and then I looked at the document, and I said I needed a few days to consider. My mother said, of course. She finished her wine. She left. The document was still on my table. I looked at it for a long time after she left. Then I made a call. What my mother did not know is that I had not been sitting still for 11 months. I had been moving carefully in the direction I had been moving since long before that engagement party. The lender position was one piece. The second piece was something I had been building with a former securities lawyer I had hired away from a Bay Street firm the previous spring. Her name is Odette, and she's the kind of person who reads an incorporation document the way a surgeon reads an imaging scan, looking for the thing that does not belong. Odette had found the thing. The clause my mother used to reclassify my shares had been inserted into the original documents during a routine amendment 9 years ago. My father had signed it, but there was strong evidence he had not understood its full implications. His handwriting on the page was rushed, inconsistent with his usual signature on documents from that period. More importantly, the amendment had never been properly disclosed to the minority board members at the time of signing. Under Ontario corporate law, that made the reclassification procedurally vulnerable. It was not a guarantee, but it was a thread, and Odette knew how to pull threads. The third piece was the auditor. The man my mother had hired had once worked at the same firm as a compliance officer I had brought in for a restructuring job 2 years ago. I knew things about his track record. Nothing illegal, nothing I would weaponize unprofessionally, but enough that when Odette reached out to him privately and explained the procedural problems with my mother's amendment, he became suddenly very interested in conducting a thorough and balanced review. The fourth piece was Elspeth Haverford. Elspeth had been on the Renner Distribution Board since my father founded it. She is 72 years old, has survived 3 recessions and 2 hostile takeover attempts, and has a particular intolerance for people who treat governance as a decorative suggestion. My mother had always assumed Elspeth was in her corner because Elspeth was polite to her face. What my mother did not understand is that Elspeth had been watching the share reclassification maneuver for months and had already submitted a formal inquiry to the board's legal counsel. I met with Elspeth once in February at a restaurant on King Street. We talked for 2 hours. I brought documents. She did not need most of them. She had done her own reading. She said she would handle the meeting. My mother called me the morning of the board meeting, sounding pleased with herself. She said she hoped I had thought carefully about what we had discussed. She said she believed I was making the right decision by not fighting this. She said, in that voice she uses when she wants to sound generous, that she had always known I was sensible underneath everything. I said I would see her at the meeting. I took a cab to the office tower on Bay Street where Renner Distribution kept its registered offices. I wore a dark blazer, plain, the kind you do not notice. I carried one folder with 4 documents inside it. I sat down at my side of the table alone, and I let my mother look across at me with that confident expression, and I did not give her anything in return. When Elspeth said she would not be accepting the audit findings, my mother leaned forward and started to explain that the board had already reviewed the procedural validity of the reclassification and had found it sound. Elspeth said that was interesting because the procedural review had been conducted by a firm whose senior partner had a pre-existing relationship with my brother's solicitor that had not been disclosed to the full board. My mother opened her mouth and closed it. My brother shifted in his chair. I did not move. Elspeth turned to the board and informed them that she had retained an independent governance expert who had reviewed the amendment in question. She placed a report in front of each board member. She said the expert had found 3 specific procedural failures in the original amendment execution and that under Ontario law, each failure independently constituted grounds to void the reclassification. If the reclassification was void, my shares were voting shares. If my shares were voting shares, combined with Elspeth's position and the 2 board members she had quietly spoken with in the preceding weeks, I held a working majority. My mother stood up. She said this was a coordinated attack. She said I had always been vindictive and that this was proof. She said she would take this to the Ontario Superior Court and that she had documentation proving I had committed fraud against the company and that she would not allow me to do this to our family. Elspeth said calmly that if she intended to present fraud documentation to the board, she was welcome to do so, but that the board would simultaneously need to examine the irregularities in the accounts receivable that the lender's internal audit had identified 3 months ago, irregularities that appeared to correspond to vendor billing that my brother had approved directly. My brother went very still. My mother looked at him. He looked at the table. She looked back at Elspeth. Then she looked at me. I looked at her the way I had looked at her from across my kitchen table when she told me she was doing this because she loved me, without expression, without anger, just looking. She sat down. What followed was not loud. It was not dramatic in the way boardroom scenes in films are dramatic. It was methodical and extremely boring in the way that real institutional consequences tend to be. Elspeth moved to restore my shares to their original voting classification. The motion passed 5-2. My mother and Pippa, who held a proxy for my brother's seat after he suddenly needed to leave the room, voted against. Everyone else voted in favor. Then Elspeth moved to refer the accounts receivable irregularities to an independent forensic accountant for review. That passed unanimously. My mother voted for it, which I thought was interesting. I think she believed it would look worse if she did not. I think she was already calculating what she could distance herself from. She was going to be disappointed. The forensic accounting process took 6 weeks. I will not describe it in detail because most of the detail is now part of an ongoing civil proceeding that I cannot discuss publicly. What I can tell you is that my brother had been approving inflated invoices from a freight subcontractor in which he held an undisclosed ownership stake. The inflated billing had been ongoing for 4 years. The total amount diverted was significant, enough that the lender, once informed, moved to enforce a covenant breach in the operating credit agreement. That enforcement process was handled by the fund that controlled the lender position. The fund's operational decisions in this matter were made by my consultancy. My brother hired a criminal defense lawyer. He called me twice. I did not pick up either time. Pippa called me once in the middle of the forensic review period from a number I did not recognize. When I answered, she spent 40 seconds telling me that I was destroying an innocent man, and then she started crying. I said I was sorry she was going through a difficult time. I said that if her husband had concerns about the process, his lawyer knew the appropriate channels. She called me a word I will not repeat here. I ended the call. My mother came to my apartment again in March. I did not let her in. I spoke to her through the partially open door while she stood in my hallway with her coat still on, and she said all the things I expected her to say. She said I had ruined the family my father built. She said he would be ashamed. She said she had given me every advantage and I had repaid her with betrayal. She said she had always known I was cold, that there was something wrong with me, that I had never been grateful. I let her say all of it. Then I said, very quietly, that my father had called me 2 months before he died and told me he was sorry he had not protected me from the way things worked in that family. I said I thought about that call often. I said I hoped she would find a way to take care of herself during what was going to be a hard year. I said good night. I closed the door. I stood in my hallway for a while afterward, and I thought about whether I felt anything. I looked for grief or guilt or the particular pain that comes from being seen clearly by someone who made you and still finding yourself insufficient. I looked for all of that. What I found was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes after a very long noise finally stops. It is now 7 months since the board meeting. My brother is working through a restitution agreement with the company and with the lender in lieu of criminal proceedings, an arrangement that involved considerable legal complexity and that was contingent on full cooperation with the forensic audit. He and Pippa have listed the house in Rosedale. I do not know where they are moving. I have not asked. My mother's position on the board was not renewed at the annual general meeting in June. She contested it. The vote was not close. She has retained a civil litigation lawyer, and there are proceedings I am told may take years to resolve. Elspeth called me the morning after the AGM. She said she thought my father would have found the whole thing satisfying. I said I thought he would have found it sad mostly. She said yes, she supposed that was probably true. We talked for 20 minutes about a board recruitment she wanted my input on, and then she had another call and we said goodbye. I am still running the consultancy. We completed 3 restructurings this year and we have a fourth in due diligence. I work long hours. I do not go to family events because there are no family events anymore, which is strange in a way I had not anticipated. Not painful, just strange. Like a sound you have been hearing for so long you stop noticing it. And then one day it is gone and the silence has a texture. I keep thinking about what winning is supposed to feel like. I had an idea of it before everything happened. I imagined it would feel the way a good verdict feels, clean and definitive, a door closing. It does not feel like that. It feels more like putting down a bag you have been carrying so long you stopped noticing the weight, and then standing in the middle of a room and looking at your hands, which are empty, and thinking about what you want to carry next. My father used to say that the most important question in business was not what something was worth, but what you were willing to pay to hold on to it. He was talking about companies. I think he might have also been talking about something else. If you have ever had to choose between your family and your own survival, If you have ever stood in a room full of people who were supposed to protect you and realized you were completely alone, I want you to know that being alone in that room does not mean you are losing. It might mean you are the only one who can see the whole board. Leave a comment and tell me where you are in your story. And if this one meant something to you, subscribe because there is more where this came from. I keep coming back to the moment my mother slid that document across my kitchen table and told me she was doing it because she loved me. Not the boardroom, not the vote. That moment in the kitchen, with the wine she brought like it was a normal visit, with her voice soft and patient, the way it gets when she has already decided how something ends. What I understand now that I did not fully understand then is that the situation had a logic to it that had nothing to do with me personally. My mother and my brother had built a version of the family company that required someone to absorb the cost of their decisions. When my father was alive, the system held together because he held it together. When he died, the weight had to go somewhere. They chose me because I had left, because I was easier to paint as unstable, as difficult, as the one who had always been a problem. That choice was not random. It followed a pattern that had been running for years. I just had not been watching it clearly enough to see where it ended. What changed for me was not anger. Anger was always there. What changed was that I stopped waiting for them to see me accurately and started asking a different question entirely, which was what I could actually build with what I had. The consultancy was not revenge in the beginning, it was survival. It was me deciding that if the family structure was going to treat my competence as a threat, I would take that competence somewhere it was valued. What happened afterward, the lender position, the governance review, audit finding, the procedural failures, none of that was a plan in the beginning. It was just the result of doing good work long enough that the right pieces were in place when I needed them. I think about Elspeth sometimes. She did not owe me anything. She had known my mother for decades. She acted because she understood that governance matters, that the rules of fair process exist for a reason, and that letting people rewrite them quietly because they have social connections is how institutions rot from the inside. Her integrity was its own kind of intelligence. She saw the full picture when most people in that room were only looking at the surface. What I learned from all of it, from my father's call in the hospital, from the engagement party, from my mother at my door in March, is that there are three things that actually protect you when everything else falls away. The first is knowing what you actually stand for, not what you say you stand for, but what you are willing to pay a real cost to defend. The second is doing the work to understand the situation clearly, without wishful thinking, without letting your feelings about how things should be distort your reading of how things are. The third is staying with it when it is slow and unglamorous, and you are not sure it is working, which is most of the time. My brother is working through his restitution. My mother is in litigation. Pippa has a new Instagram where she posts about fresh starts. None of this feels like victory in the way I imagined. It feels more like the end of a very long winter, where you are not celebrating the warmth so much as just quietly noticing that the ground has finally stopped being frozen. My father was right about what you are willing to hold on to. I think I finally understand what he meant.